And welcome back, all you bulls and bears and betas out there, to the buzz of this Proxyopoly spin-off series we call the Proxyopoly Podcast. I'm your host, the Proxyopolist, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades. Here again with another exclusive proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report for the publicly traded asset manager 79.49% owned by Deutsche Bank, DWS Group. Or as it is said in German, Die Wertpapierspezialisten, which translates to the securities specialists in English. But prior to moving forward in this discussion, I would like to take a moment to dedicate this particular episode to my grandmother, Solveig, who endured the German occupation of Norway as a teenage girl and an American citizen. In the time I was lucky enough to learn from her before her passing in 2023, she would recount an event from our family's time in the resistance against the Nazis, which I vividly recall daily. In this event, she is babysitting her younger cousin, and while she has her back turned, this child finds the family radio and turns it on full blast as a German soldier walks by outside. As it was told to me, the soldier turns to make eye contact with my young grandmother through the window, pauses, and then proceeds to keep walking instead of following orders. I think we know what those orders were supposed to be, and how they were not followed through serves causality as to how I'm here talking with you all today. The moral of this story I have carried with me every day, including as the underlying reason why I chose to work for Deutsche Bank as a proxy for peace in the first place, is that it's the orders we choose not to follow which truly define us and make all the difference in the outcome of events. Lastly, before introducing the Proxyopoly TM score for DWS Group, I'd like to formally disclose that I was, in fact, employed by DWS Group and Deutsche Bank from 2016 to 2023. As secretary of its proxy voting subcommittee all 7 years, I've worked with and have had the pleasure of getting to know many financial professionals all over the world dedicated to acting as a fiduciary, carrying out their principled responsibility to act in the best economic interest of clients' principal investments. To all of my former colleagues and stakeholders of its general partner who trusted me with this awesome responsibility, before I resigned in 2023 for the personal reasons I've shared with you now. I would like to make my amends for not doing the right thing sooner. You trusted me, and I failed you. For that, I am sorry. If there is anything I can do to make that right, it is my hope that will be partly deliberated in this podcast episode, and that we might resume dialogue if you have any further inquiries afterward. Thank you, listeners, the Proxyopolists at home, for allowing me the opportunity on this platform to share my story with you. So all of us, me, my family, my friends, stakeholders of the general partner, and public markets at large, may now undergo the healing process from this trauma. Now, without any further delay, let's get started, shall we? Introduction. DWS Group, GmbH & Co., KGaA, is a Frankfurt-based asset manager carved out via IPO, initial public offering, from Deutsche Bank in 2018, yet still firmly under Deutsche Bank's dominion. Today, Deutsche Bank AG owns 79.49% of DWS's voting shares, with only 20.51% approximately in public float. This outsized stake, coupled with DWS's unusual KGaA legal structure, grants Deutsche Bank near total control over DWS's governance. A Kommandit Gesellschaft auf Aktien, KGaA in an acronym form, as they so oft to do, is a German hybrid partnership corporation form that entrenches the general partner, a Deutsche Bank subsidiary in this case, as the sole managing authority, largely insulated from shareholder influence. DWS's external shareholders can elect a supervisory board and vote on certain matters, but cannot appoint or remove the executives running DWS Group. The result is a governance paradox, a publicly traded asset manager with a €1 trillion assets under management footprint, yet functionally controlled as a Deutsche Bank fiefdom. This Proxyopoly TM research report applies the Proxyopoly TM ratings framework, a critical data-grounded system analogous to market beta, to quantify how DWS's governance structure and conduct influence public market governance dynamics. Each of the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings measures a different dimension of proxy power concentration, with 0 representing a market average baseline balance and swings into the positive or negative, indicating divergence from the norm, respectively. In this context, negative values generally signal a contestable, shareholder empowering setup, whereas positive values indicate a more entrenched, management-favored regime. Values over positive 1 essentially translating to a proxy monopoly immune to outside influence. Proxyopoly TM assesses DWS across the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings being 1. Proxy accumulation resistance or PAR. 2. Bylaw fortification index or BFI. 3. Shareholder hostility quotient or SHQ. 4. Executive entrenchment factor or EEF. And 5. Regulatory evasion measure or REM. Each Proxyopoly TM rating is discussed with sardonic accuracy because DWS's recent history, especially in its greenwashing saga, merits both scathing critique and objective analysis. The findings are stark. DWS emerges as a case study in Proxyopoly TM extremes. A near monopolist controlling stakeholder in Deutsche Bank fortified bylaws via its KGaA construct, a pattern of brushing off shareholder concerns, deeply rooted executive insulation, and a high-profile run-in with regulators over ESG, environmental social governance, claims all of these push DWS's ratings well beyond the market median. In these sections of this podcast to follow, Proxyopoly TM will detail each rating, present DWS's numeric Proxyopoly TM score to a 2 decimal point precision, and synthesize how these factors produce DWS's overall Proxyopoly TM score. Finally, Proxyopoly TM offers pointed governance reform recommendations, as well as 2026 AGM voting recommendations. For shareholders seeking to tame DWS's shareholder abuse and restore a semblance of balance in its governance, the tone will mix hard, factual objectivity with a critically sardonic edge, holding DWS's feet to the fire for the governance flame that it started, shortcomings DWS is accountable for, while never straying from documented evidence. Thus concludes Section 1 of the introduction. Now moving on to Section 2, the Proxyopoly TM ratings for DWS Group. And again, these Proxyopoly TM ratings underlie the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score and are calculated in a proprietary methodology to arrive at the final Proxyopoly TM score. Proxyopoly TM rating number 1. Proxy accumulation resistance, or PAR. Definition: Proxy accumulation resistance gauges how difficult it is for outside investors to accumulate enough voting power to influence corporate control or policy. A highly positive PAR indicates a proxy fortress, a structural barrier so high that a dissident shareholder campaign is virtually futile. A negative PAR would conversely indicate a company where an activist could realistically win a vote with relative ease or low resistance. The market average being 0, with negative values denoting vulnerability to shareholder action and positive values denoting entrenched control. In the Proxyopoly TM analysis for DWS Group, DWS's proxy accumulation resistance comes out at positive 4.20, an extremely entrenched position above 0. The average, the balance. This is unsurprising, given that Deutsche Bank holds approximately 80% of DWS's shares. In practical terms, outside investors collectively owning just 20.51% shares outstanding cannot hope to outvote or overturn any decision that Deutsche Bank supports. DWS might as well be a wholly owned subsidiary for proxy contest purposes. The deck is irretrievably stacked in management's favor. Even if every single minority shareholder allied behind an activist agenda, they would still fall short of the votes held by Deutsche Bank alone. The theoretical path for change is essentially non-existent. So that means if you're going to pay X amount of dollars for a DWS share, that money is not going to pay for a vote. At all. No change whatsoever. What's the point of even having ownership of a company if you can't vote on it? If it's not going to have a meaningful say? If it's all an illusion? If it's all just a smoke and mirror game to lubricate the gears of Deutsche Bank and stroke their fucking egos? The only sliver of solace for minority shareholders is a German quirk. Shares held by the general partner, Deutsche Bank's subsidiary, cannot vote on supervisory board elections. This theoretically gives external shareholders a louder voice in choosing shareholder representatives on the board. In practice, however, Deutsche Bank's influence looms large even there, through nominations and informal sway. And the supervisory board of a KGaA has limited power anyway. In normal corporate governance terms, DWS is an outlier of low contestability. It would take nothing short of Deutsche Bank's voluntary consent or a massive reduction in its stake to alter the status quo. The proxy accumulation resistance of positive 4.20 reflects that DWS is a proxy monopoly stronghold. External agitators face an almost insurmountable uphill battle to accumulate meaningful voting clout. The ramifications for public investors are profound. Under average conditions, a negative proxy accumulation resistance, Proxyopoly TM rating for a company, might bend to shareholder pressure if performance falters or if a compelling activist comes along. At DWS, by contrast, management as installed by Deutsche Bank can ignore minority discontent with impunity. There is no credible threat of a hostile takeover, proxy fight, or even a shareholder resolution passing against Deutsche Bank's will. This super resistance puts DWS well into the entrenched fortress territory of the Proxyopoly TM rating scale, scoring higher than any other company thus far on this podcast series utilizing this proprietary framework, justifying the strongly positive proxy accumulation resistance. Moving on to the next Proxyopoly TM rating. Proxyopoly TM rating number 2 for DWS Group, being the Bylaw Fortification Index, or BFI. Definition: the Bylaw Fortification Index measures how the company's charter and governance provisions fortify management's control or inhibit shareholder-led changes. It examines structural armor, such as dual-class stock, poison pills, supermajority vote requirements, limited rights to call meetings or nominate directors, staggered boards, etc. A high positive BFI signals or signifies a dense web of entrenchment provisions. A corporate minefield for shareholders, if you will. Whereas a negative BFI indicates a relatively open, shareholder-friendly rulebook. Essentially, BFI asks, have the company's architects built legal battlements to fend off outside influence? In the analysis for DWS Group, DWS's Proxyopoly TM rating for the Bylaw Fortification Index is positive 2.35, marking it as one of the most heavily fortified governance structures in the market. Notably, DWS didn't need exotic poison pills or dual-class super voting shares to achieve this. Instead, it relies on the inherent entrenchment of its KGaA corporate form and the dominance of its parent shareholder, Deutsche Bank. The entire governance architecture is tailor-made to constrain public shareholder power. Noting the KGaA structural shield, unlike a normal Aktiengesellschaft, fucking hey, how do you fucking say that? This language you speak is horrendous. Every single soft-handed dilettante at that fucking bank, when they get the opportunity, should cut their fucking tongues off, because this is freaking ridiculous. Excuse me. Unlike a normal Aktiengesellschaft, AG, or stock corporation. DWS's setup as a KGAA means the general partner, DWS Management GmbH, a Deutsche Bank subsidiary, solely manages the company. The general partner, effectively Deutsche Bank itself by itself, has unlimited liability, but in exchange cannot be ousted by shareholders. The Supervisory Board of DWS cannot appoint or remove DWS's executive directors or the general partner's managing directors. It also cannot set executive pay, veto management decisions, or impose procedural rules on the general partner. These are extraordinary limitations. In a standard corporation, a discontented board or shareholder majority could replace a failing CEO or push governance reforms. At DWS, however, those safety valves are sealed shut by bylaw design. The KGAA framework is essentially a built-in anti-takeover and anti-accountability mechanism. It's the legal equivalent of a poison pill that permanently immunizes management from shareholder intervention. A related topic in the Bylaw Fortification Index for DWS Group is Deutsche Bank's veto power and joint committee. Key strategic decisions at DWS likely require Deutsche Bank's blessing through formal or informal channels. According to Moody's, DWS's majority owner influences management appointments and approves major moves. However, a joint committee does exist, with Deutsche Bank delegates and independent supervisory board members. And this committee must approve certain general partner actions and even has a say in ratifying management's acts. While ostensibly a governance checkpoint, the Joint Committee's design actually reinforces Deutsche Bank's control. It is chaired by Deutsche Bank's CFO, Chief Financial Officer, as of late 2023, James von Moltke, and includes 2 members delegated by Deutsche Bank, ensuring the parent's interests carry heavy weight. In effect, DWS's bylaws create an extra board above the board, where Deutsche Bank holds the cards. This layered structure makes it even harder for ordinary shareholders to effect change. There are more hoops to jump through, and Deutsche Bank holds most of those hoops. Another topic of discussion for the Bylaw Fortification Index when referring to DWS Group is we consider it's 1 share, 1 vote, 1 owner. On paper, DWS has a classic 1 share, 1 vote capital structure. No dual class stock or voting rights shenanigans. Good for you. However, the spirit of 1 share, 1 vote, the equal treatment of all shareholders, is undercut when 4 out of 5 votes belong to one entity owner. You guessed it, Deutsche Bank! The 79.49% stake acts as a de facto supermajority requirement for any charter amendment or significant shareholder action. No proposal can hit the 80% threshold without Deutsche Bank's approval, because Deutsche is that threshold. Boo! In practice, this is more stringent than any poison pill. It's a perpetual supermajority lock held by a single master. Even though DWS's charter may allow simple majority votes to amend bylaws, that's academic. When one holder controls that majority. We have one more thing to bring up in the bylaw fortification index, and then we'll move on, and that is the limited shareholder rights at DWS. DWS's minority investors do have the standard rights on paper. For example, the ability for 5% owners to add agenda items or 10% owners to call an extraordinary general meeting under German law. But exercising these rights at DWS is largely symbolic. For instance, shareholders can call a meeting or propose a resolution, but Deutsche Bank's votes will decide the outcome regardless. The Supervisory Board election process is one area of theoretical minority influence, since Deutsche Bank's affiliate cannot vote its shares for those seats. Outside investors collectively elect the shareholder representatives. Once again, that's an important note. I will say it one more time so that all of you hear it. The Supervisory Board election process is one area of theoretical minority shareholder influence, since Deutsche Bank's affiliate cannot vote its shares for those seats. Outside investors collectively elect these shareholder representatives. This could have led to a more balanced board, however. Because Deutsche Bank's stake is so dominant, it effectively handpicks nominees who then sail through with minority support, especially if no alternative slate is offered. Case in point, in 2024, Oliver Behrens, a former Deutsche Asset Management executive, but presented as an independent voice, was recommended to replace Deutsche Bank's Karl von Rohr as Supervisory Board chairperson. Behrens was duly elected, and while his resume shows independence from Deutsche Bank in recent years, he's a familiar friend of DWS, having led parts of Deutsche Asset Management in the past. They were once one and the same before the IPO in 2018. Reminder, red flags, bada bing. This illustrates that even quote-unquote independent governance enhancements occur on Deutsche Bank's terms. All these layers of fortification justify DWS's Proxyopoly TM rating for the bylaw fortification index of positive 2.35. A rating signifying extraordinary bylaw offenses in the Proxyopoly TM lexicon. DWS's governance is a corporate minefield for any insurgent investor. Not necessarily a bad thing, not a fucking great thing either. There is no poison pill in the traditional sense, but one isn't needed. The combination of the KGAA legal structures and the controlling parent shareholder is entrenchment on steroids. By contrast, many companies with far weaker defenses, for example, modest supermajority requirements or classified boards, will receive ratings of slightly positive or slightly negative, even neutral, somewhat on the BFI. We don't do 0 quite yet because it's kind of like an imperfect number. It is an infinitesimally small number you can reach before you reach 0 on both sides, but that's about as far as we've got with the Proxyopoly TM ratings in this point. Show me a fucking perfect company. Ironically, DWS's bylaws might appear ordinary at first glance. After all, KGAA is an allowed structure, and there's no multiple class stock. Once again, good for you. You did the fucking bare minimum. But the practical effect is profoundly anti-shareholder. It is a reminder that a company can comply with formal governance norms, yet completely subvert shareholder empowerment by strategic design. DWS has done exactly that. The high BFI score reflects that DWS's rule book is built to fortify management. And by that we mean Deutsche Bank against any and all unwelcome interference. Moving on to the next Proxyopoly TM rating. Proxyopoly TM rating number 3. The shareholder hostility quotient, or SHQ. Definition: the shareholder hostility quotient assesses management's and the board's attitude as well as its responsiveness toward shareholder interests, particularly outside minority shareholders. It covers both policy and tone. Frequent neglect of shareholder concerns, adversarial communications, reluctance to engage or compromise, poor transparency, or actions that dilute or undermine shareholder rights all contribute to a higher or more hostile shareholder hostility quotient. A high positive SHQ suggests a management team that treats shareholders as a nuisance or even a threat. How insecure could you be? Whereas a negative SHQ would indicate a culture of openness, proactive engagement, and alignment with shareholder value creation. In other words, SHQ captures whether the company's leaders are shareholder-friendly or stewards of defensive empire building. For the analysis of DWS in the shareholder hostility quotient as a Proxyopoly TM rating, DWS's SHQ registers at positive 1.26, signaling a notably hostile stance toward shareholder input, especially from the minority public investors. This hostility is both structural and behavioral. We cite a few examples here, so bear with me. Structural disregard of minority shareholder voices. As detailed previously, DWS's governance gives minority shareholders very limited power, but beyond the formal structure, there's an evident, ambivalence, if not irritation, toward outside shareholder demands. The overwhelming control of Deutsche Bank means DWS's leadership doesn't need to court minority approval on most matters. This has bred a culture where shareholder discontent can be brushed off easily. For example, consider the recurring calls from shareholder advocacy groups at DWS's AGMs in 2024 and 2025. Oh my goodness. The Dachverband der Kritischen Aktionärinnen. You people need to wash your fucking tongues. Because that translates to Association of Critical Shareholders. And this group submitted counter-proposals to refuse discharge of management and the supervisory board, citing the ESG greenwashing scandals and inadequate climate strategy. These are serious accusations, effectively votes of no confidence. Yet DWS's response has been formulaic and dismissive, relying on Deutsche Bank's votes to bulldoze such objections. The critical shareholders painstakingly documented DWS's failings, from 25 million euros in greenwashing fines from German prosecutors to ongoing civil lawsuits, and urged accountability. DWS's management, however, gave no indication of mea culpa beyond platitudes, and indeed had those proposals voted down, predictably, given Deutsche Bank's 79% voting position. The rote rejection of well-founded shareholder grievances underscores a hostile quotient. Management's instinct is to defend itself and reject criticism rather than sincerely engage and address investor concerns. Another subject to bring up in the shareholder hostility quotient is DWS's defensive and dismissive tone. DWS leaders have often adopted a minimizing tone about controversies that matter to shareholders. A glaring example is the company's characterization of its own misconduct. After regulators found DWS misled investors with exaggerated ESG claims, DWS acknowledged only that its, quote, marketing was sometimes exuberant, unquote. I'll show you exuberant marketing. What a euphemism for what prosecutors flatly called statements that, quote, did not correspond to reality. This phrasing came in DWS's official statement on the Frankfurt investigation's conclusion, essentially trivializing the findings of greenwashing to concerned investors, particularly those investing in DWS for its touted sustainability leadership. Such a flippant admission falls flat. It suggests management is more concerned with saving face than owning up to missteps. Similarly, ex-CEO Asoka Vorman dismissed the whistleblower allegations as unfounded, right up until the point police raided DWS's offices. This pattern, deny, diminish, deflect, reveals a leadership mindset defensive towards criticism, not collaboration with shareholders who raise red flags. Another factor in the shareholder hostility quotient for DWS Group is poor transparency and accountability. Shareholders value clear, accurate information to evaluate management. In DWS's case, transparency has been a casualty of its hostility. The initial ESG claims by DWS Group were overstated, labeling 459 billion euros in assets under management as quote-unquote green, when an internal review showed only a fraction truly were. It took whistleblower action and regulatory intervention for the truth to out. Even after that, DWS's steps to rebuild trust have been halting. For instance, rather than fully revamping its sustainable funds after 2021, DWS chose superficial fixes. DWS simply renamed 45 funds to drop terms like ESG or sustainable in advance of new European Union rules, allowing those funds to keep investing in fossil fuel companies. This semantic shell game, detailed in a May 2025 report, quote, betrays investors' trust, according to analysts, by misdirecting capital that was meant to be green to a reasonable shareholder. Such tactics signal that DWS's priority is avoiding scrutiny rather than genuinely aligning with shareholder values. In this case, the desire for credible, sustainable investments. The lack of candor, whether in marketing materials or in failing to admit fault until forced, contributes heavily to the shareholder hostility quotient. It positions DWS's management at odds with shareholders who expect, at the very fucking least, integrity and accountability. Next factor in consideration for the shareholder hostility quotient of DWS Group is summed up as engagement versus evasion. On routine investor calls, DWS's new CEO, Stefan Hoops, has tried to strike a more conciliatory tone on some issues. To his credit, this is not an easy job he walked into. Focusing on turnaround success and market opportunities. Even warning about an AI stock bubble as a thought leader sometimes. I'm only citing what you said, boss. Shoot your shot to the hoops. That's a basketball reference. Purely basketball reference. And indeed, Hoops can point to an 80% stock rise in price since mid-2022, which might placate purely financially driven shareholders. However, when it comes to governance and ESG issues, the approach remains defensive. Hoops emphasizes that trust needs rebuilding. Yet, concrete actions, like truly overhauling ESG investment criteria or fully cooperating with civil society groups, lag behind. Meanwhile, critical voices, be they NGOs or concerned institutional investors, report that DWS has, quote, done nothing to earn this trust, unquote, in the years after the scandals, continuing business as usual in fossil fuel heavy funds. The company's minimal interaction with these stakeholders outside of formal proceedings indicate a preference to keep its own course rather than incorporate outside feedback. In sum, the shareholder hostility quotient has a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.26, reflects that DWS's leadership has exhibited a sustained streak of shareholder unfriendliness. They have a luxury of an all-powerful parent shareholder in Deutsche Bank, and have acted accordingly, often appearing tone-deaf to minority shareholders' legitimate concerns. Whether it's dismissing a record-setting greenwashing fine as overzealous marketing or sidestepping the spirit of new ESG regulations, DWS's actions telegraph that management's instinct is to preserve its autonomy and public image, even if that means obfuscating and overruling shareholder input. The irony is thick. For an asset manager whose business relies on investor trust, DWS's governance behavior has been eroding that very trust. A high shareholder hostility quotient is the consequence. Moving on now to Proxyopoly TM rating number 4 for DWS Group. The Executive Entrenchment Factor, or EEF. By definition, the Executive Entrenchment Factor measures how securely dug in the top executives and directors are, beyond what normal performance-based job security would provide. It looks at leadership structure and practices that insulate incumbents. For example, combined CEO chairperson roles, lack of succession planning, interlocking directorates, golden parachutes, long tenure without refreshment, nepotism or insider dominance, and any governance choices that make removing or replacing leaders difficult. A high executive entrenchment factor means the executive team and board are highly insulated from replacement, whereas a negative EEF would indicate a leadership cadre readily accountable and easily restructured if needed, signifying low entrenchment. In the analysis for DWS, for the executive entrenchment factor, DWS Group has earned a Proxyopoly TM score of positive 3.14. One of the most extreme entrenchment readings on record for this Proxyopoly TM framework. This is hardly surprising, given DWS's parent-controlled KGaA governance, which is practically an entrenchment machine. A few key factors drive this score, and we're going to talk about them now, and you're going to listen, Proxyopolists at home. One of the factors is management's unaccountability to shareholders. In a normal public company, if executives underperform or become embroiled in scandal, the board, spurred by shareholder pressure, can fire or replace them. At DWS, however, shareholders have zero direct role in hiring or firing top executives. The managing directors are the executive board of the general partner, who are appointed and dismissed by Deutsche Bank via the shareholder meeting of the general partner. The DWS Supervisory Board is explicitly not entitled to appoint or remove these managing directors. This means CEO succession is a family affair, literally decided within Deutsche Bank's hierarchy. Indeed, when former CEO Asoka Varman resigned in 2022 amid the raids and the allegations, Deutsche Bank parachuted in Stefan Hoops to save the day, a long-time Deutsche Bank executive, as the new CEO of DWS Group. There was no broader search or consultation with DWS's minority investors. It was an internal shuffle. Hoops's appointment illustrates the entrenchment dynamic perfectly. DWS's leadership is drawn from Deutsche Bank's talent pool, answerable primarily to Deutsche Bank's top brass. If Deutsche Bank's interests are served, DWS's executives remain secure, regardless of what external shareholders might think of their performance on ESG or other matters. This arrangement makes it virtually impossible for disaffected shareholders to catalyze a leadership change. Votes of no confidence, like refusing to discharge management at the AGM, are symbolic and non-binding. Deutsche Bank's support ultimately determines an executive's fate, not the public market's view. Another factor under consideration for the executive entrenchment factor. Oh, we got all the freaking factors here. Interlocking influence and lack of independence. Executive entrenchment at DWS is buttressed by the blurred lines between parent and subsidiary. Key figures in DWS's governance have worn dual hats. Until mid-2024, Karl von Rohr, president of Deutsche Bank, served as chairman of DWS's supervisory board. An obvious alignment of interest with the controlling owner. Even after von Rohr stepped down as chairperson, Deutsche Bank ensured its influence. It nominated Oliver Behrens, a veteran of Deutsche Bank's asset management arm, as the new chair, and Behrens was elected in June 2024. While Behrens is described as an independent shareholder representative now, his long history with DWS and Deutsche Bank suggests a friendly pair of hands. Moreover, Deutsche Bank executives populate the Joint Committee. The same Joint Committee that oversees major decisions and compensation. For instance, James von Moltke, Deutsche Bank's chief financial officer, became the chair of that Joint Committee in November 2023. This interlocking governance means the same circle of people effectively monitor and reward themselves. DWS's top managers ultimately answer to individuals and the board. Deeply tied to Deutsche Bank, not to an independent set of independent oversight. There is no fully independent check on DWS executive performance, akin to an autonomous board in a typical company. Hence, an entrenched management can persist unless the parent decides otherwise. Another topic of discussion in the executive entrenchment factor for See how confusing it is for DWS group? Longevity and succession planning. As a relatively new public entity, since 2018, its IPO, DWS doesn't yet have decades-long CEO tenure to cite. But entrenchment isn't just about one person's tenure. It's about how predictable and insular the succession pipeline is. So far, DWS's pipeline has been strictly DB insider only. When Vorman took over in 2018, he was a Deutsche Bank insider replacing another Deutsche Bank insider of Nicolas Moreau. Stefan Hoops, the current CEO, is Deutsche Bank through and through. Formerly head of Deutsche Bank's corporate bank division. The pattern is clear. Outsiders need not apply. Gatekeepers, man. This insularity suggests that unless Deutsche Bank itself undergoes a leadership revolution that cascades down, DWS will continue to be led by executives who are steeped in the parent bank's culture and chosen for their loyalty to it. Such succession practices entrench not just individuals, but an entire groupthink, a worldview aligned with Deutsche Bank's priorities over those of minority shareholders. We also note that the 15-year term limit nominally in place for DWS's supervisory board members, not to mention an age cap of 75, are you serious? Is hardly a stringent anti-entrenchment measure. 15 years on the board is an eternity in governance terms, and exceptions beyond the age of 75 are allowed in the bylaws. Egregious. As per the company's own description of board tenure policy given, quote, exceptional cases, unquote, there is scant evidence of robust board refreshment driven by performance. Changes seem driven by Deutsche Bank's internal decisions. For example, Von Rohr's step down coinciding with his broader Deutsche Bank exit, and so on. Moving on to the next item of discussion for the executive entrenchment factor, and this is the last one. Executive compensation and accountability. Entrenchment is also fostered when executives face weak consequences for poor governance. DWS's handling of the ESG scandals raise questions here. Despite the missteps under Vorman, there's no public indication that pay was clawed back or bonuses were significantly docked at the time issues emerged. In fact, in 2023, DWS paid substantial fines in the US and later Germany for greenwashing allegations. But by then, Vorman was already gone, with reported severance or bonus preservation, if any, not transparently disclosed. Meanwhile, the new leadership's incentives could still be emphasizing asset growth or stock price, metrics which Hoops has delivered on, even as governance issues linger. If compensation schemes do not penalize ethical lapses, and DWS's 2025 compensation report will be revealing on this front, then executives enjoy a cushioned ride. A shareholder proposal in 2025 to refuse management discharge explicitly argued that DWS showed, quote, no sign of a genuine desire for transformation, unquote, and lacked, quote, concrete reform steps to effectively prevent greenwashing in the future, unquote. That critique implies that management had not been held adequately accountable internally. Otherwise, we'd see, for instance, new leadership in sustainability roles, or at least a remuneration pay overhaul for the executives. Without internal accountability, top managers remain comfortably in place as long as Deutsche Bank is content as parent shareholder. Combining these factors, DWS earns a Proxyopoly TM rating for the executive entrenchment factor of positive 3.14, denoting extreme executive entrenchment. The company's leadership is virtually irreplaceable by external force. They are entrenched by structure, by network, and by lack of effective independent oversight. Shareholders can't vote them out. The parent bank's alignment is too strong, and so on. In Proxyopoly TM terms, this is a textbook case of management being dug in like an Alabama tick. Removal will require a conscious act of self-cleansing from within. So is this basically Proxyopoly TM telling Deutsche Bank to go to fucking rehab? Yes, it is! Deutsche Bank will have to decide that change is needed for its own reasons. And this is your fucking intervention. For public markets, this has become a red flag in terms of entrenchment. This means if DWS's executives theoretically, but let's be honest, probably in all likelihood, ever pursue strategies contrary to minority shareholder interests, be it aggressive marketing, risky bets, or neglect of ESG promises, or even if that was aligned with Deutsche Bank's interests and DWS executives wanted to go against it independently of Deutsche Bank, all shareholders, minority and majority, would have few remedies. And that would be a good or bad thing depending on what side of the majority and minority you're on. You gotta visualize the pie chart. I've been doing this for a long time. I got so much experience in the proxy. And anyway, the entrenched nature of DWS's leadership thus contributes heavily to its overall Proxyopoly TM risk profile. Ergo, DWS Group has earned an executive entrenchment factor of positive 3.14. And now moving on to the fifth Proxyopoly TM rating for DWS Group. The Regulatory Evasion Measure, or REM. Definition: the regulatory evasion measure calculates a company's propensity to skirt regulations, push legal boundaries, or engage in practices that attract regulatory sanctions. It's effectively a gauge of governance risk from a compliance perspective. Companies that habitually find themselves in the crosshairs of regulators for fraud, corruption, consumer protection issues, antitrust, ESG misrepresentation, etc., or that exploit loopholes to dodge oversight will earn higher Proxyopoly TM ratings on the regulatory evasion measure. A highly positive REM means the firm has a history of evasive maneuvers, often short-term profit-seeking that runs afoul of laws or rules, whereas a negative REM would imply a culture of strict compliance and cooperation with regulatory expectations, even beyond the letter of the law. In the analysis for DWS, for the regulatory evasion measure, DWS has earned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.49, reflecting a significant concern raised by its run-ins with regulators and the cunning tactics it has employed in the ESG, environmental social governance, arena. Over the past few years, DWS has become something of a case study in greenwashing enforcement, which is emblematic of a broader compliance problem. Some key points about the regulatory evasion measure for DWS Group: the greenwashing scandals and sanctions. DWS Group infamously touted itself as an ESG leader with sustainability in its DNA, only for investigators to discover that these claims were grossly exaggerated. The fallout has been severe. In 2023, the United States Securities Exchange Commission and Department of Justice investigated DWS following whistleblower reports, resulting in DWS agreeing to pay $25 million in the U.S. to settle charges of ESG misstatements and inadequate anti-money laundering controls. Then in 2025, German prosecutors concluded their probe and levied a 25 million euro fine, the largest ever in Germany, for greenwashing charges after finding DWS guilty of misleading investors about its environmental social governance ESG practices. Prosecutors stated bluntly that DWS's public ESG claims, quote, did not correspond to reality, constituting breaches of investment law. DWS was effectively caught selling snake oil, claiming half of its assets were ESG integrated when internal criteria would only count a fraction of that, not to mention that there was no separate proxy voting policy and guidelines for ESG labeled funds. I know this for a fucking fact. The regulatory evasion measures soar for this reason. With these indictments alone, Few publicly listed asset managers have had to pay such penalties for deceptive marketing. The fact that DWS's misrepresentation persisted from 2018 to 2021 and was only halted by external intervention indicates a willingness to bend or ignore regulatory expectations. Here, the expected honesty in ESG disclosures to benefit from the ESG investment trend. Importantly, DWS's settlement neither admitted nor denied wrongdoing, which is standard legal phrasing, but does very little to reassure that the company truly understands what it did wrong. Another key point in consideration for the regulatory evasion measure are the anti-money laundering control failures. Tied to the SEC settlement was another alarming issue. DWS failed to develop a proper anti-money laundering program for one of its mutual funds. In an era where regulators globally are hammering financial institutions for lax anti-money laundering controls, DWS's lapse is notable. It suggests compliance corners may have been cut, possibly to reduce costs or complexity, in a way that violated the Bank Security Act, which requires robust anti-money laundering procedures. While the fine for that was rolled into the $25 million U.S. settlement, the underlying message is that DWS's internal controls were deficient in basic areas of risk management. The regulatory evasion measure captures this as a red flag. If a firm can't implement something as fundamental as an anti-money laundering framework for a fund, a bread and butter obligation in finance, one wonders what other corners might have been or might still be cut in pursuit of efficiency or profit. This is a public safety concern. Another key point in consideration for the regulatory evasion measure is DWS's very creative compliance. Noting some semantic evasion here, as regulators tightened the screws, DWS demonstrated a tendency to comply in form rather than substance. Essentially, regulatory evasion by creative semantics. A dramatic example unfolded in 2024 to 2025 with the new ESMA guidelines on fund names. These European Union rules aimed to stop greenwashing by banning terms like, quote, sustainable, unquote, or, quote, unquote, ESG in fund names unless the fund meets strict fossil fuel exclusion and 80% sustainable investments criteria. DWS's response? It scrubbed the offending terms from fund names or swapped in weaker words. According to a joint NGO analysis by Ergewald, Finance Vend, Facing Finance, DWS renamed 45 funds. 28% of its ESG-themed lineup to avoid triggering the new rules. What a fucking joke. For instance, DWS ESG XYZ Fund might become DWS Enhanced XYZ Fund, removing the explicit ESG label, but keeping the essentially the same holdings, including fossil fuel companies. This tactic allowed DWS to bypass the intended effect of the regulations, which was to ensure funds with green names were actually green. By exploiting the loophole that ESMA's rule covered certain words but not synonyms like, quote, screened, unquote, or vague terms like, quote, balanced, unquote, DWS can continue business as usual, marketing fossil inclusive funds to sustainably minded investors, now under a different moniker. NGOs rightly slammed this as, quote, not just rebranding, but betraying investors' trust, unquote, and misdirecting capital from true sustainability goals. In terms of REM, this is a classic example of regulatory evasion, following the letter of the law, no forbidden words and names, while undermining its spirit, still facilitating investments in coal, oil, gas, via funds that investors assume are responsible. Such savvy maneuvering shows a compliance culture that is reactive and legalistic rather than proactive and ethical. Final key point for the regulatory evasion measure are the continuing legal risks. Even after the fines, DWS isn't out of the woods. The Frankfurt prosecutor's office case ended with a fine and no admission, but civil litigation has begun. For instance, a consumer protection association in Germany, Baden-Württemberg, son of a bitch, filed a lawsuit accusing DWS of misleading advertising related to climate impact claims. DWS preemptively issued a cease and desist on the specific ads to moot the case. But the episode shows the legal system is still probing DWS's past statements. Additionally, as of May 2025, it was reported that the first civil trial for greenwashing against DWS had commenced, with investors seeking damages for being misled. These ongoing proceedings underscore that DWS's tendency to push the envelope has tangible consequences and material costs. Financial penalties, legal expenses, and reputational damage that can linger for years. DWS's regulatory evasion measure of positive 1.49 thus encapsulates a company that has tested the limits of trust and regulation, then got burned. Unlike some firms that might quietly adjust after a minor infraction, DWS's infractions were high profile and required regulatory smackdowns in multiple jurisdictions. And rather than turning over a new leaf entirely, DWS's compliance approach has at times seemed to be, quote, how can we get around this rule, unquote, more than, quote, how do we embrace its intent, unquote, For shareholders and the public, a high regulatory evasion measure is a warning sign that governance failings could recur, unless DWS truly internalizes the lessons. The fact that DWS's own statement on the issue emphasized improvements in, quote, documentation and control processes, unquote, is encouraging, but only to a point. Effective compliance is as much about culture and honesty as it is about processes. It remains to be seen if DWS's culture has changed. I think I would know. I was a part of it for 7 years. A culture of never admitting fault, always having to lie and cover things up. How do you live with yourselves? Well, I just couldn't anymore. I resigned after my director asked me to directly lie. It's going to be okay if you lie. Not when you do it to shareholders, because that's a fucking crime. For now, the REM, regulatory evasion measure, reflects the track record I have just mentioned to date. One that skews heavily toward evasion and subsequent enforcement. Now that all 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings for DWS Group have been laid on the table accordingly, we now have time to take a short intermission, talk about some sponsored content or contributed content, while the Proxyopolists at home perhaps run to their pantry and grab a snack. Maybe you reach in there and, oh, there's your traditional proxy advisor that you're tired of. Maybe you want to get yourself a new proxy advisor. But let's say that there's so much regulatory pressure in this current political regime that you couldn't possibly foresee, as a Proxyopolist, getting a new proxy advisor until more forecasting has been done. Well, there's Proxyopoly TM with your solution. You see, Proxyopoly TM is not your traditional proxy advisor. It is a diagnostic framework for you, the Proxyopolist at home, whether you be a retail investor or large institutional investor. And you try to figure out how to vote these proxies. They're coming from everywhere. Oh, there's so many of them there. Oh, there's in the millions. I only own $100 worth of stock. How do I have 1,000,000 proxies? It's all too much. Oh, you Proxyopoly yokels. It's simple. You can follow the Proxyopoly TM on all the important social medias. And you can find these exclusive proprietary Proxyopoly TM research reports on the Patreon, which can be found on the link tree in the show notes. Thus concludes the first intermission. Now back to the lean of the Proxyopoly. All right, Proxyopolists, it is now time to calculate the final Proxyopoly TM score for DWS Group. Combining the 5-component Proxyopoly TM ratings, DWS's final Proxyopoly TM score is positive 2.49. This score is markedly above the Proxyopoly TM framework balance, which centers at 0.000, and so on, signaling that DWS represents a significantly above average systemic governance risk, essentially an outlier in how much its internal power dynamics can impact market governance norms. To arrive at this figure, we have taken the proprietary calculated weighted average normalized of the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings. To run through those once again so the Proxyopolist at home can understand how we arrived at the final Proxyopoly TM score, the underlying Proxyopoly TM ratings for the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score are as follows. Proxyopoly TM rating number 1. Proxy accumulation resistance. DWS has a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 4.20. Proxyopoly TM rating number 2. Bylaw Fortification Index. DWS has earned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 2.35. Proxyopoly TM rating number 3. Shareholder Hostility Quotient. DWS has earned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.26. Proxyopoly TM rating number 4. Executive Entrenchment Factor. DWS has earned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 3.14. Proxyopoly TM rating number 5. DWS has earned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.49. Hence how we arrived at the calculated weighted normalized average of the Proxyopoly TM ratings to get that final Proxyopoly TM score. I think the Proxyopolists at home understand. These ratings, as detailed above, reflect DWS's profile of extreme entrenchment, offset by aggressive governance pitfalls. The extremely high positive proxy accumulation resistance is accompanied by strongly positive scores in BFI, SHQ, EEF, and REM, suggesting that entrenchment via ownership, fortified bylaws, hostile posture, entrenched management, and regulatory dodginess are all taken into consideration in these factors. The arithmetic result is a positive composite score above positive 2. In terms of interpretation, a final Proxyopoly TM score above positive 2.0 indicates that DWS's unaccountable governance characteristics could have a volatile, outsized impact on public market governance dynamics, analogous to a high beta stock in finance. It is a company likely to produce governance shocks or controversies that ripple beyond its own corporate boundaries. For instance, DWS's greenwashing saga has already sent reverberations through the financial industry, prompting regulators to toughen sustainable finance rules and putting other asset managers on notice. A firm with a more average Proxyopoly TM score, say around 0.0, might handle environmental social governance, ESG, integration, or shareholder engagement in stride with industry norms, causing little drama. DWS, by contrast, swings to extremes as an overly concentrated ownership and insulated management led to complacency, which in turn led to a major scandal, now influences sector-wide behavior. In that sense, DWS's Proxyopoly TM score of positive 2.49 encapsulates a governance profile that is volatile and potentially destabilizing from market oversight perspective. It's the kind of score we'd assign to firms that, for better or worse, move the goalposts on governance, often to the detriment of minority shareholders and market transparency. It's also worth noting that DWS's Proxyopoly TM score is elevated by the fact that it operates in a domain with systemic importance. Asset managers like DWS are gatekeepers for capital allocation. Their governance failings can have outsized effects. For example, misrepresenting ESG investments not only harms DWS's investors, but can stall broader progress in sustainable finance by eroding the trust. The Proxyopoly TM score captures this by not shying away from values above positive 2 for such players when justified. While DWS is not the largest global asset manager, its entwinement with a global systemically important bank in Deutsche Bank and its high-profile regulatory run-ins put it firmly in the camp of those whose governance merits heightened scrutiny. In summary, the Proxyopoly score of positive 2.49 reflects a company in DWS far from equilibrium in the balance of power between insiders and public stakeholders. It indicates that public markets should approach DWS with caution. Normal governance mechanisms like shareholder votes, independent board oversight, transparent compliance, etc., are sufficiently out of kilter that DWS can surprise or disappoint investors in ways a typical company might not. The final Proxyopoly TM score, of course, is not a moral judgment, but a risk indicator. And here that risk indicator signals tilted risk in management's favor, often at shareholders' expense. It's a perfect storm of governance volatility. A controlled company with compliance baggage in a critical industry. In any event, the final Proxyopoly score of positive 2.49 underscores that DWS has more in common with highly entrenched, controversial giants than with a typical mid-cap firm when it comes to governance risk. Now, the Proxyopolists at home might be asking, what is Proxyopoly TM going to do about all of these governance risks for DWS Group? Well, that's where the next section of this podcast episode comes into play. Governance policy change recommendations. That's right, Proxyopolists. We're now going to talk about the recommendations for changes at DWS Group in terms of policy so that Proxyopoly TM score might drift down closer to a more balanced number, closer to 0. We'll see how successful they can be if they take Proxyopoly TM up on these recommendations. Despite DWS's challenging starting point, there are concrete steps that could improve its governance equilibrium, mitigate governance risks, and restore trust with public shareholders as well as stakeholders. The following policy change recommendations target the heart of DWS's issues: the imbalance of power, the lack of accountability, and the need to credibly commit to compliance and sustainability. These reforms aim to gradually unwind the proxy monopoly which exists at DWS and infuse more transparency as well as accountability into DWS's corporate governance. Governance policy change recommendation number 1. Transition DWS from a KGAA to a more shareholder accountable structure. The single biggest governance fix would be for DWS to convert from a KGAA to a regular Aktiengesellschaft AG, or similar structure where the managing board is answerable to an independent supervisory board by all shareholders. This admittedly is a tall order, as it would require Deutsche Bank's assent to relinquish its special status. If an outright conversion is too radical, DWS could pursue intermediate steps. For example, amending its articles to voluntarily subject certain general partner management decisions to supervisory board approval, even though not required by law, or to allow minority veto rights on critical issues. Another step could be establishing a policy that the general partner will not block reasonable shareholder-sponsored governance changes, such as amendments to enhance shareholder rights, effectively a self-denying ordinance by Deutsche Bank to use its 79% vote more judiciously. These changes would signal that DWS is willing to loosen the iron grip of the current structure. Reducing the structural fortification would directly address the sky-high bylaw fortification index and proxy accumulation resistance ratings by empowering outside shareholders bit by bit. Governance policy change recommendation number 2. Gradually reduce Deutsche Bank's ownership stake. In tandem with structural reform, Deutsche Bank should consider selling down its stake in DWS over time to increase the public float. This might have possibly been the long-term intent of the initial public offering, IPO, initially positioning DWS as a separate entity. Moving Deutsche Bank's ownership from 79% to, say, 60%, then maybe 50%, or even below, would materially change the calculus of shareholder influence. It would invite greater institutional investor participation and potentially even interest from strategic shareholders who value DWS's franchise and could advocate for stronger governance. While Deutsche Bank might be reluctant, DWS is a profitable asset management unit. There are benefits for Deutsche Bank too. A broader shareholder base could raise DWS's market valuation, currently likely discounted due to governance concerns associated with Deutsche Bank. And Deutsche Bank could, ergo, recycle capital into its core banking business. For DWS, a more diffuse ownership would increase scrutiny and make it more responsive to market discipline, thus reducing the proxy accumulation resistance. Concretely, even an incremental move, for example, an additional 10 to 20% of shares placed with the market, would demonstrate commitment to improving governance and could coincide with granting those new shareholders a louder voice, perhaps through a formal minority shareholder committee to liaise with management. Now moving on to governance policy change recommendation number 3. Empower and refresh the Supervisory Board and Joint Committee. DWS should strengthen the independence and expertise of its Supervisory Board and, by extension, the Joint Committee. This means ensuring that a majority of shareholder representatives on the board are truly independent of Deutsche Bank and have all the skill sets to challenge management, especially in areas of ESG, environmental social governance, compliance, and risk. The recent appointment of an independent chair in Oliver Behrens is a step in the right direction. Building upon that, however, DWS could bring in new board members with specific sustainability and regulatory backgrounds. For example, a former regulator or an ESG investment expert to head a revamped Risk and Sustainability Oversight Committee at the Supervisory Board level. Moreover, reform the Joint Committee's composition. Deutsche Bank delegates 2 members who have tended to be Deutsche Bank executives. DWS could voluntarily add more independent members or limit the general partner's delegates to 1, so that Independents, including employee representatives who bring an internal perspective, form the majority. Additionally, give the Joint Committee a broader mandate for oversight of strategy changes and major transactions, not just a reactive approval role. In practice, this would mean the Joint Committee must publicly affirm that any major product rebranding like ESG fund renamings or new business venture has been reviewed for alignment with stated policies. By bolstering both of these bodies, DWS can inject a layer of accountability that is currently missing. Creating forums where tough questions are asked and management is answerable beyond Deutsche Bank's echo chamber. Governance policy change recommendation number 4. Introduce robust environmental social governance, ESG, and compliance oversight mechanisms to rehabilitate its reputation and avoid future regulatory run-ins. DWS should create a permanent high-level ESG and compliance advisory council that includes external experts. For instance, enlist independent advisors such as respected environmental academics, former regulators, or leaders from the responsible investment community to periodically review DWS's ESG product claims, climate strategy, and compliance systems. The Council's findings should be reported directly to the Supervisory Board or Joint Committee and summarized to shareholders annually for transparency. Additionally, DWS should conduct a thorough external audit of its ESG data and marketing akin to a financial audit, but for sustainability reporting, and publish those results. This would go beyond the new requirement of auditing sustainability reports, which is item 5 spot 3 at the annual general meeting in 2026. It would involve assurance on whether DWS's fund classifications and advertising are accurate. The goal is to preemptively catch and correct any greenwashing or compliance issues before regulators do. Over time, DWS could institutionalize a practice of, quote, truth in labeling, unquote. Any fund name or marketing term must be vetted against a stringent criteria, perhaps even stricter than regulators, set by an independent panel. By willingly submitting to higher scrutiny, DWS can signal that the era of, quote, exuberant marketing, unquote, is over and a culture of compliance is taking root. This addresses the regulatory evasion measure by reducing regulatory evasion naturally and demonstrating genuine corrective action. Moving on to governance policy change recommendation number 5. Align executive compensation with long-term ethical performance. DWS needs to overhaul its incentive structures to ensure executives are rewarded for sustainable growth and penalize for compliance failures. Specifically, the compensation system for the managing directors, which shareholders will vote on in item 8 of the agenda of the annual general meeting in 2026, which should be amended to include explicit ESG and compliance KPIs. For example, a portion of the annual bonus could be tied to achieving concrete sustainability targets, like increasing the percentage of funds meeting high ESG standards without greenwashing, and to maintain a clean compliance record, no significant audit findings or fines. Even more importantly, incorporate a malice/clawback provision that triggers if any misconduct or misrepresentation like the past greenwashing comes to light. ensuring that responsible individuals cannot retain bonuses earned under false pretenses. If such a clawback policy had been in place in 2018 to 2020, it would have disincentivized overstating ESG capabilities. Right now, public shareholders are rightly concerned that DWS's leadership faces asymmetric rewards, upside for asset growth, no downside for bending the rules. By recalibrating pay in this manner, DWS would align management's interests with long-term shareholder value and ethical conduct. This reform could sway shareholder sentiment enough to turn a failed say-on-pay into a passed one. It directly chips away at the executive entrenchment factor and shareholder hostility quotient issues by making executives less untouchable and more accountable. In the Proxyopoly TM sense, it introduces a feedback loop. If management doesn't play fair, they personally feel the sting, not just the shareholders. Governance policy change recommendation number 6. Enhance shareholder communication and participation rights. Given the distance that has grown between DWS management and its minority shareholders, the company should make a concerted effort to re-engage and rebuild trust. This includes holding regular shareholder forums or town halls, virtually or in person, where investors can ask questions outside the formal annual general meeting and where DWS responds substantively to concerns, especially on topics like climate strategy and or corporate governance. DWS should also revise its stance on virtual annual general meetings. While German law now allows fully virtual meetings, and DWS has certainly embraced that, much to some shareholders' chagrin, the company ought to consider offering hybrid annual general meeting formats going forward, combining the accessibility of virtual attendance with the transparency and engagement of physical meetings. The critical shareholders have argued that purely virtual AGMs dampen participation and shield management from face-to-face accountability. Adopting a hybrid approach voluntarily would show DWS values broad participation and is not trying to evade tough questions. Furthermore, DWS can improve participation rights by lowering the threshold for adding agenda items or calling EGMs, extraordinary general meetings, even if just as a gesture. For example, pledging not to object if a group of shareholders below the legal 5% comes forward with a reasonable proposal. Small changes like extending the Q&A window for online questions, publishing detailed answers on the investor relations website post-AGM, and disclosing the voting results with breakdowns to highlight how the free float voted versus Deutsche Bank, as it would also add transparency in this context. Collectively, these steps work toward reducing the shareholder hostility quotient, showing that DWS is moving from a hostile posture to a more shareholder-friendly stance. Governance policy change recommendation number 7. Strengthen risk culture and whistleblower protections. One lesson from the DWS saga is that internal voices tried to signal problems, but they were not heeded. DWS should revamp its internal risk oversight and whistleblower program to ensure that employees who flag ethical or compliance concerns are protected, listened to, and taken seriously, not shown the door. This might involve appointing an independent ethics ombudsperson, ideally someone with a reputation for integrity and completely outside the Deutsche Bank sphere, to whom employees can report concerns confidentially. That ombudsperson would report critical issues directly to the Supervisory Board's Audit Risk Committee. Additionally, tie a portion of senior management's evaluations to how well they cultivate a speak-up culture. If another whistleblower situation arose, DWS's goal should be to address the issues internally before they become public scandals, treating the whistleblower as a valued sentinel rather than an adversary. Regulators often look at the robustness of internal compliance culture when assessing fines. Improving here could preempt future sanctions and thereby reduce the regulatory evasion measure as well as governance risks in general over time. Implementing these governance policy change recommendations would require a change of mindset at DWS and, crucially, the cooperation of Deutsche Bank as the controlling shareholder. However, the long-term payoff is substantial. A governance structure that commands higher investor confidence, potentially a higher valuation, and certainly fewer costly crises. In essence, DWS would be moving away from being a proxy monopoly poster child and toward being a modern asset manager with credible governance. Each step chips away at the proxy monopoly armor, empowering shareholders, instilling accountability, and embedding compliance, gradually normalizing DWS's Proxyopoly TM ratings toward the market average. Shareholders and independent observers should hold DWS to account on these suggestions because without pressure, a proxy monopoly as entrenched as DWS may otherwise remain comfortably static to the detriment of the market at large. Having now concluded the governance policy changes recommendations section of this podcast, and prior to diving into the most exciting section, the voting recommendations for the upcoming 2026 annual general meeting of DWS, we will take a short intermission for the Proxyopolist at home to listen to me plug in some sponsored content and or contributed content. So walk to the fridge, pop open a nice ice-cold Diet Proxy, and sip on it like a fridge cigarette, you Adderall junkies. Anyway, time's up. Moving on to the next section of this podcast, the 2026 Annual General Meeting Voting Recommendations as published by Proxyopoly TM. For DWS's 2026 Annual General Meeting, shareholders face a slate of standard resolutions in an extraordinary governance context. In the following section, Proxyopoly TM provides recommendations on each agenda item using yes or no in line with German voting conventions, as opposed to for or against, accompanied by a brief rationale in 3 to 5 sentences rooted in the Proxyopoly TM proxy voting policy and guidelines analysis to supplement any material controversies listed or cited therein. These recommendations aim to balance routine corporate needs with the imperative to send a message on DWS's governance and performance failures. Note before we get started, in a KGAA AGM, formal quote-unquote voting is on resolutions and discharge rather than direct election of executives. However, for the sake of ease of use, Proxyopoly TM will treat each agenda item with equivalent scrutiny. Agenda item number 1, adoption of the annual financial statements for fiscal year 2025. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, yes. Proxyopoly TM finds no indication of accounting irregularities in the 2025 financial statements. They appear to have been prepared and audited in accordance with applicable laws and standards. Rejecting the financial statements would primarily harm shareholders by creating legal uncertainty, rather than effectively addressing governance issues. Despite broader concerns about management conduct, the accounts themselves provide a transparent record of DWS's performance, including the provisioning of fines relating to past misconduct. A yes vote is warranted to acknowledge the sanctity and veracity of financial reporting, while reserving tougher scrutiny for the governance and discharge resolutions. Agenda item number 2, appropriation of distributable profit for the 2025 fiscal year. In other words, the dividend. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote no. Typically, approving the dividend aligns with shareholder interests in receiving a return on investment. However, in this case, there is evidence that the proposed profit distribution is imprudent. DWS remains profitable and the dividend would be paid proportionally to all shareholders if approved, albeit withholding approval would punish minority shareholders at least as much as management, or even more so, punish its majority shareholder, Deutsche Bank. Moreover, this vote recommendation is to deny Deutsche Bank its 79.49% share of the dividend as a rebuke of the majority shareholders' interests until substantive changes have been made. This vote recommendation might be considered by some a protest, to be counterproductive, and likely ignored by the controlling vote. But there is evidence that foregoing this year's dividend and withholding support from this agenda item is in the best long-term economic interest of minority shareholders. Therefore, the Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation of no is appropriate, signaling to Deutsche Bank that minority shareholders would prefer corporate reform to lessen legal risks of the stock's beneficiary ownership. Agenda item number 3, ratification of the acts of management of the general partner for fiscal year 2025. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote no. This vote, essentially a discharge of the general partner's management, is the primary mechanism for shareholders to express dissatisfaction with executive conduct, and in DWS's case, it is richly deserved. And now for supplemental context of this agenda item referring to the discharge of the general partner. It is now time for the moment you have all been waiting for, Proxyopolis. The reveal of the identity of the general partner at large. The general partner has sole responsibility for the management of DWS, including all management measures. The general partner is acting through its managing directors, otherwise known as Gesellschaftsführer. Damn, y'all are really trying to cancel me today. Who collectively are referred to as the Executive Board of DWS. The Executive Board manages the day-to-day business and represents DWS vis-a-vis third parties. The managing directors of the general partner are appointed and dismissed by resolutions of the shareholders' meeting of the general partner, which also has the authority to appoint one of them as chairperson or even the CEO. And we will now reveal the names of the general partner. Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Stefan Hoops. Chief Financial Officer, Dr. Marcus Kobler. Chief Client Officer, Dirk Gorgan. Chief Product Officer, Manfred Bauer. Chief Administrative Officer, Dr. Karen Kuder. Chief Technology and Operations Officer and Head of Chief Operating Office Division, Rafael Otero. And Chief Investment Officer, Vincenzo Veda. Proxyopoly TM has requested as a counterproposal that the general partner liable to unlimited extent be refused discharge. In the following justification, the general partner liable to unlimited extent has failed to meet the long-standing and appropriate handling of scandals surrounding greenwashing and ensuring the integrity of sustainable financial products. DWS had to pay fines of 25 million euros for greenwashing and investigations by the Frankfurt Public Prosecutor's Office. The reputational damage for the DWS is considerably higher. The background was misleading information on supposedly sustainable investment practices. The Public Prosecutor's Office found violations of the capital investment law. This was the highest sentence ever imposed in Germany for greenwashing offenses. This concerns the core activity of DWS, the management of client assets based on the credible information and responsible strategies. As early as 2023, DWS had to pay a fine of 23.5 million euros in the USA, equivalent in dollars, because of the excessive ESG promises, overpromising and underdelivering, creating a debt that they couldn't fulfill or cash for their own profit. Further trials are still pending. In May 2025, the first civil lawsuit against DWS in terms of its greenwashing charges began. Despite repeated public criticism, the company's management has for years made ESG statements that simply did not correspond to the facts. This should have been terminated early and without external investigations by DWS itself. This structural weakness in governance is not only a failure of individual executives, but an expression of systemic deficits for which DWS bears joint responsibility within the group. The statement of DWS that it was only a, quote, partially exuberant marketing, unquote, seems unduly trivializing, given the level of the penalty and the clear assessment of law enforcement. So far, there has been no sign of a genuine desire for transformation, especially with regard to the sustainability strategy and transparency. There is a lack of concrete reform steps to effectively prevent greenwashing in the future, in particular with regard to the executive exclusion of investments in fossil fuels and independent and effective verification processes for sustainability claims. Voting no reflects shareholders' loss of confidence in management due to the greenwashing scandal and compliance failures that occurred under its watch. Between 2020 to 2023, DWS's management misled investors about environmental, social, governance, ESG capabilities, leading to record fines and a reputational hit that is still playing out in the courts. The general partner's leaders trivialized these issues as exuberant marketing instead of fully owning up, and only acted to replace a CEO, namely, once raids and public scrutiny forced their hand to do so. A no vote on this agenda item, specifically the discharge of the general partner, is a symbolic but important call for accountability, signaling that shareholders do not endorse management's past actions, particularly its traits of entrenchment and evasion, and putting pressure on Deutsche Bank to drive meaningful change in DWS's culture and leadership. Agenda item number 4. Ratification of the acts of management of the members of the Supervisory Board for fiscal year 2025. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote no. The Supervisory Board is charged with monitoring and advising management, and in 2025 it fell short, especially on oversight of DWS's sustainability strategy and risk controls. A no vote is warranted to rebuke the board for failing to prevent or adequately respond to the greenwashing debacle and its aftermath. On this agenda item, the discharge of the Supervisory Board for fiscal year 2025, we will once again reference the identity of the general partner. DWS KGaA's sole general partner, DWS Management GmbH, is a wholly owned subsidiary of DB Beteiligungsholding GmbH, which is 100% owned by Deutsche Bank AG. DWS KGaA's corporate bodies are its general partner, acting through its managing directors, who collectively are referred to as the Executive Board, as well as its Supervisory Board, and the shareholders of DWS KGaA. Not to mention the fact that DWS also has a joint committee. Proxyopoly TM formally puts forth a counterproposal to deny discharge to the members of the Supervisory Board for fiscal year 2025. The identity of the Supervisory Board is as follows. Noting which members of the Supervisory Board sit on respective committees of importance within the company, as well as those who also sit on the joint committee. The Supervisory Board advises and monitors the General Partner, acting through the Executive Board in its management of the company. Chairman, Independent Shareholders Representative Oliver Barons, member of the Joint Committee and Chair of the Nomination Committee. Deputy Chairwoman, Independent Shareholders Representative Uta Wolf, member of the Joint Committee, as well as Chair of the Audit and Risk Committee. Independent Shareholders Representative Professor Dr. Christina E. Banier, member of the Remuneration and Personnel Committee. Independent Shareholders Representative Aldo Cardoso, member of the Audit and Risk Committee, member of the Remuneration and Personnel Committee. Independent Shareholders Representative Richard I. Morris, Jr., member of the Audit and Risk Committee, member of the Nomination Committee. Non-independent Shareholders Representative and former Chairperson Carl Von Rohr. Independent Shareholders Representative Margaret Sakale, member of the Nomination Committee, Chair of the Remuneration and Personnel Committee. Shareholders Representative Tomohiro Yao, member of the Joint Committee, representing Nippon Life. The members of the Supervisory Board, with the exception of the employee representatives, are elected by the General Partner, and all this information is per DWS's website. And when trying to look up the terms of reference for its Supervisory Board, I was met with some 404s. That seems a bit purposeful, don't you think? Except for the employee representatives of the members of the Supervisory Board are elected by shareholders of DWS at the general meeting. In general, the authority and scope for the influence of the Supervisory Board is limited for DWS. In particular, the Supervisory Board is not entitled to appoint or dismiss the managing directors of the General Partner, as referenced in Agenda Item 3. Nor may the Supervisory Board subject the management measures of the General Partner to its contents or incite rules of procedure for the General Partner. The justification for rejecting the discharge of the General Partner, namely the Supervisory Board, is that the Supervisory Board has a central responsibility for the strategic orientation of the company and for the long-term control of the company's management, in particular with regard to risks, sustainability, and again, long-term corporate goals. In its role as Supervisory Board, the board failed to adequately fulfill supervisory duties in the 2025 fiscal year, especially regarding DWS's inadequate climate strategy and continued adherence to its flawed fossil fuel business models. Despite the obvious strategic shortcomings regarding the lack of ESG control and strategy monitoring by the Supervisory Board, no publicly comprehensible steps by the Supervisory Board to fundamentally change the course of DWS in this area have become known. although it was announced during the year that companies would have to submit transformation plans to phase out coal by the end of 2025, even here there is a lack of clear enforcement mechanisms to discharge these events for 2025 in the year 2026. In addition, it is unclear to what extent the Supervisory Board regularly and critically monitors the company's ESG and climate strategies. The results so far, including the fine of millions for misleading sustainability claims, cast doubt on effective control. In responsibility for DWS's failed transformation, the view of ongoing climate crisis and the increasing regulatory requirements imposed by the European Union, the Supervisory Board should have demanded far more ambitious and transparent measures in its supervisory role. The reluctance and adherence to its flawed fossil fuel business models is at odds with credible ESG governance. In the 2025 financial year, the Supervisory Board failed to press ahead with the strategically necessary alignment towards a future-proof business model. This does not justify discharge. Discharge under these circumstances would amount to the confirmation of inadequate control and deficit in ESG oversight. It is the responsibility of the Supervisory Board to monitor such developments and to provide strategic support. The events surrounding the greenwashing affair and the slow pace of reappraisal raise the question of whether the Supervisory Board has sufficiently fulfilled this role or failed in its purpose. The lack of consistency in personnel policy, the lack of structural reform, impetus, and the support given to the ESG communication strategy so far casts doubt on an effective supervisory function by the Supervisory Board. Despite clear warning signs and public criticism over DWS's inadequate climate approach, the board did not press for a sufficiently ambitious shift. For example, DWS still allows numerous quote-unquote sustainable funds to remain invested in coal and oil, simply rebranding names to dodge regulations, a strategy that the board should have challenged as undermining the company's credibility. Moreover, the board's apparent acquiescence to Deutsche Bank's tight grip, for example, deferring entirely to the general partner on executive succession and strategy, exemplifies the bylaw fortification and hostility quotient issues identified in this podcast episode. Voting no on this agenda item signals that shareholders expect the Supervisory Board to exercise a more independent and climate-conscious oversight role going forward, rather than rubber-stamping management's evasive maneuvers. Agenda item 5.1. Election of the Auditor for annual financial statements and the Auditor of the Consolidated financial statements. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote yes. Proxyopoly TM recommends a yes vote for the appointment of the proposed external auditor to ensure the continuity in audit coverage of DWS's financials. There have been no red flags regarding the auditor's performance in auditing the books. The financial statements have been reliable, and any issues like provisions for fines were duly reflected. Importantly, the auditor's role, while critical for financial integrity, is distinct from the ESG misrepresentations, which were more a product of marketing and internal classification than of financial accounting. With enhanced scrutiny expected on sustainability reporting, retaining a reputable auditor will be key for rebuilding trust. Unless the auditor's independence is compromised, which there's no evidence of to date, A yes vote is prudent to maintain a stable audit oversight during a period when DWS's controls are being strengthened. Hopefully. Moving on to agenda item 5 spot 2, the election of the auditor for limited review of interim financial reports. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, yes. This item usually appoints the auditor for half-year reviews or other interim statements. A yes vote is consistent with the rationale for agenda items 5 spot 1. It keeps the same qualified audit firm in place throughout the reporting cycle. Interim reviews, albeit less extensive than full audits, give shareholders confidence in the continuity and consistency of financial oversight, especially as DWS works through restoring credibility. Having the interim figures vetted by a trusted auditor provides an added layer of assurance that no unpleasant surprises are lurking. Proxyopoly TM sees no cause to withhold the approval here. Doing so could disrupt DWS's reporting process without delivering any governance benefit. Ergo, recommendation, vote yes. Moving on to agenda item 5 spots 3. Election of the auditor of the sustainability reporting. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, yes. Starting in 2026, DWS will produce enhanced sustainability reports, likely under European Union regulations like CSRD, and appointing an auditor for this is a welcome development. Proxyopoly TM recommends yes, as this signifies DWS's commitment to have its ESG disclosures independently verified, a critical step given the recent history of overstated ESG claims. An external audit of sustainability data will help ensure that, quote, what DWS sells as green is truly green, unquote, addressing investor concerns directly. Approving this auditor also aligns with the previous recommendation that DWS embrace more transparency. It's a sign that the company is bowing to the need for credible verification. Proxyopoly TM expects the chosen auditor firm will be competent in ESG assurance. Voting yes on this agenda item gives them the mandate to start scrutinizing and improving sustainability reporting immediately. Moving on to agenda item number 6, resolution on approval of the compensation report for fiscal year 2025. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote no. A no vote on the say on pay, the compensation report, is warranted to express shareholder dissatisfaction with how executive pay has been handled in the light of DWS's issues. The 2025 compensation report likely reveals that top executives still received substantial bonuses during a period when the firm paid millions in fines for misconduct. Shareholders should reject this report if it doesn't clearly demonstrate pay consequences for the ESG scandal. For example, were any bonuses clawed back or downward adjusted due to the greenwashing penalties? If not, management has been rewarded despite damaging the company's reputation and incurring costs, which indicates misaligned incentives. A no will signal that shareholders expect a compensation system that holds leaders accountable. Pay must be meaningfully tied to compliance and long-term sustainable performance, as opposed to just short-term inflows or stock price. Until the compensation reflects that alignment, something the Proxyopoly TM analysis flags as lacking, there is advice opposing the report to push DWS to reform its pay practices. Moving on to agenda item number 7, election to the Supervisory Board. Any new nominees? Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote no. This agenda item is to encapsulate any election of any new directors to the board without prejudice to any individual. Proxyopoly recommends no on electing any new proposed supervisory board members unless that nominee demonstrably brings independent, shareholder-aligned oversight. Even while Deutsche Bank's votable shares are excluded from elections of members of the supervisory board, so that minority shares have true say on independent boardroom oversight. This recommendation stems from DWS's track record of board appointments being heavily influenced by Deutsche Bank and lacking in effective challenge on crucial issues. If the nominee is another insider or status quo candidate, a no vote is crucial to register that shareholders want directors who will shake up the culture, not cozy placeholders. Even if the nominee has decent credentials, shareholders are justified in being skeptical. The current board failed to prevent governance failures, so any new addition must be a change agent. A no vote on this agenda item can compel DWS and Deutsche Bank to either reconsider the candidate or future nominations, ideally favoring someone who with strong ESG and compliant expertise and true independence. In short, unless the candidate's profile is clearly a step toward fixing the entrenchment and hostility problems, Proxyopoly TM errs on the side of voting no to demand better. Moving on to agenda item number 8. Resolution on the approval of the compensation system for the managing directors of the general partner. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote no. This resolution seeks endorsement of the policy framework for DWS executive pay. Proxyopoly TM urges a no vote because the current compensation system evidently failed to prevent or address the behaviors that led to DWS's greenwashing fiasco. As of now, there's little evidence that substantial ESG or risk metrics are integrated into DWS's bonus structure. Had they been, perhaps management would have been more measured in its ESG claims. Moreover, unless the new system explicitly includes clawback provisions and limits on rewards when regulatory penalties occur, it remains inadequate. Voting no sends a clear message that shareholders expect an overhaul of pay for performance, specifically a system that rewards sustainable value creation and penalizes ethical lapses. Given DWS's Proxyopoly TM score, tying management down with strong incentives is one of the few levers shareholders have. Thus, they should reject the system on the table if it's not up to global best practices. Moving on to agenda item number 9. Resolution on approval of the compensation of supervisory board members, including the compensation system and a corresponding amendment to the Articles of Association. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote no. The supervisory board is asking shareholders to approve its pay, and possibly a raise or structural changes to it. Proxyopoly TM recommends vote no as a matter of principle this year. The board has not earned a rubber stamp on its compensation in light of its oversight failings. In 2024 and 2025, the board presided over a period of serious reputational damage and did not distinguish itself in proactively guiding DWS out of trouble. To endorse their pay now, potentially even increasing it, would send the wrong signal. This opposition is not about penny pinching, director fees, it's about accountability. Until the board demonstrates markedly improved performance, for example, by pushing DWS to adopt the governance reforms and holding management's feet to the fire on strategy and compliance, shareholders should withhold approval of lavish or status quo compensation. A vote no here also aligns with the broader dissatisfaction reflected in voting no on the discharge of the general partner, and reintroduces to board members that shareholders expect them to step up their game or face consequences in their own wallets. And moving on to the final agenda item on the docket today, that is agenda item number 10, resolution on amendments to the Articles of Association, and that includes any Articles of Association that may be included on the ballot. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote no. While the specific amendments aren't yet made public, a cautious no here is advised on any and all amendments to the Articles of Association unless these changes clearly enhance shareholder rights, which they probably, in all honesty, likely won't. In recent annual general meetings, managements of German companies, including DWS, have sought article amendments to, for example, enable fully virtual shareholder meetings on management's say-so. Such changes can often diminish shareholder engagement and oversight, allowing management greater leeway. Last year, critical shareholders opposed DWS's move to facilitate virtual-only AGMs, arguing that format decisions should rest with the shareholders, not be pre-authorized for management's convenience. Proxyopoly concurs. DWS has not yet rebuilt the trust to be granted more procedural flexibility that could limit transparency. Furthermore, any bylaw changes introduced by management with DWS's track record warrant suspicion. They could further entrench control, feeding into the bylaw fortification index concerns raised in this podcast. Unless this agenda item's content is a shareholder-friendly reform, which would be very atypical. Vote no to any article amendment that isn't explicitly in shareholders' best interests. This ensures no additional fortifications are quietly added to the already formidable Proxyopoly TM ratings you've heard on this podcast as framework defenses to governance changes to mitigate risks to public markets at large. In summary, Proxyopoly TM voting recommendations reflect a theme. Routine business, accounts, dividends, auditor appointments get support to keep the company running smoothly. But anything touching on oversight, accountability, or rewarding the stewards of DWS's malpractice is met with skepticism and often rejection. This pattern is intentional. It directs a laser-focused message to leadership. Shareholders are dissatisfied and will not rubber stamp the status quo. In conclusion, DWS Group stands at a governance crossroads. Its Proxyopoly TM score of positive 2.49 signals a company heavily tilted toward insider control, resistant to external accountability, and prone to governance pitfalls that can unsettle investors and regulators alike. This report dissected the 5 dimensions of DWS's governance structure via the Proxyopoly TM ratings. From virtually unassailable voting control by Deutsche Bank, noted in the proxy accumulation resistance, to legal fortress of the KGaA structure, noted in the bylaw fortification index, to the management's defensive disdain for outside input, noted in the shareholder hostility quotient, also noting the self-perpetuating insider leadership from the executive entrenchment factor, and the costly willingness to play fast and loose with rules in the regulatory evasion measure. Each category in the Proxyopoly TM ratings, DWS veered well away from best practices, painting a picture of a company that, despite being publicly listed, has behaved more like a feudal domain of its parent bank. The irony in all of this is that DWS's very business is managing other people's investments. It ought to understand the value of good governance as a driver for sustainable returns. Instead, its own governance lapses have eroded shareholder value, at least in reputational terms, and possibly through a suppressed stock multiple, and made it a poster child for why ESG must start at home. DWS has learned the hard way that exuberant marketing and reality-defying claims eventually meet the gravity of facts and enforcement. The record fines and ongoing legal battles are not just a black mark on DWS, they are a cautionary tale for the entire asset management industry. One German newspaper opined that this fine is a, quote, warning to the entire financial sector, unquote, on greenwashing. In that sense, DWS's Proxyopoly TM score has public consequences, reinforcing why this framework exists to identify firms where governance issues can have outsized impact beyond the walls of the boardroom. Yet, crossroads imply a choice of direction. DWS can continue down the path of entrenchment, relying on Deutsche Bank's patronage and perhaps hoping that cosmetic changes and time will fade memories of scandal. That path likely leads to stagnant trust, perpetual stakeholder skepticism, and the risk of future blow-ups. Today, ESG. Tomorrow, perhaps something else even worse. Alternatively, DWS can embrace the moment as an inflection point, a chance to reset its governance and culture, as Proxyopoly TM recommends. It won't be easy. It means persuading Deutsche Bank to loosen the reins and holding the executives genuinely accountable. But it is the route to rehabilitating DWS's standing in the eyes of investors, clients, regulators, and stakeholders at large. Encouragingly, there are glimmers of change. The appointment of a new supervisory board chair unencumbered by current ties to Deutsche Bank, the planned audit of sustainability disclosures, and CEO's Hoop's public rhetoric about rebuilding trust and cautioning against bubbles it only suggests an awareness that business as usual won't suffice. However, awareness must translate into action. The 2026 AGM will be a litmus test. Will DWS's owners, big and small, collectively push for change, or will Deutsche Bank's dominance simply rubber stamp management's agenda? Proxyopoly TM's voting recommendations err on the side of pushing hard for necessary change. Because DWS needs a strong signal from its minority shareholders and stakeholders that enough is enough. A company managing over 1 trillion euros in assets under management cannot operate with a credibility deficit. The market will eventually exact its own price if governance does not improve, be it in discounted valuation or loss of business to peers. In conclusion, DWS's governance profile in 2026 is an embodiment of a proxy monopoly in the public market. Proxy power unrestrained internally, challenged by the forces of public accountability externally. Its Proxyopoly TM score and underlying Proxyopoly TM ratings shine a light on where it must improve. This report, with its critical edge, calls out the absurdities of DWS's situation. A public company that's not really public. A sustainability champion that wasn't sustainable in its practices and far from being a champion, while also laying out a roadmap back to normalcy. The tone of this episode may have been scathing at times, but it's born of factual observation and the principle that sunlight is the best corporate disinfectant. By identifying the cracks in DWS's governance edifice, we implicitly also identify the places to shore it up. For public markets at large, the best outcome is that DWS heeds these signals. A DWS that becomes more transparent, accountable, and balanced in power will not only improve its own fortunes, but also contribute positively to market integrity. No more false ESG dawns. No more hidden control structures. It's in Deutsche Bank's interests too. Whereas a thriving DWS untainted by controversy is a more valuable asset. The onus, therefore, is on those in power at DWS to open up and let some air as well as some light in. If they do, we might see the Proxyopoly score for DWS drift down to a more balanced number closer to 0. Or perhaps an infinitesimally small number that would represent an infinitely better governed firm. Thank you for listening, Proxyopolists. I hope you enjoyed the entirety of this episode, as well as my accounting of the full story. Now it is time for the much anticipated final disclaimer. The professional opinions expressed in this podcast are property of Proxyopoly TM. The Proxyopoly TM score and accompanying analysis are purely communicative for educational and entertainment purposes only. This Proxyopoly TM research report, in its verbalized or written form, is for informational objectives only, does not constitute investment advice, and should not be misconstrued as a suggestion or an offer to buy or sell any securities. No generalist or sensationalist statements are intended or being made. Any resemblance to real-world events may be deliberate, though with DWS Group's current trajectory, reality may be catching up faster than anticipated, while past performance is not indicative of future returns. And thanks for listening, Proxyopolis. If it ain't Proxyopoly, you Proxyopolian. Lügen. Alles Lügen.